well, what is a cult? What makes a group that? And so I've come to learn about that because I wanted to know more about it. And because a lot of people will call any group that they have a personal disagreement with a cult. But we can be a lot more specific than that. Don't be culty, right? Well, what does that mean exactly? Okay, a cult, by definition, is a system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object. That's one definition. Another definition is a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister. And another definition is a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing. These are a little vague. It makes it very much dependent on your own point of view as to whether a group is a cult or not. And this word is actually, it's got an interesting history. I won't go into the history of it. I'll just say to you that it's interesting, and you can check it out. Because it was originally used back in the early 1920s when it started taking its modern definitions. It was used by fundamentalists. I mean, it actually got propagated by Christians. So instead of talking about cults, I actually clarify this or make it more specific, and I use the term destructive cult. Because a dangerous group, it's not made dangerous by its belief system. It's not what you believe. Xenu is not why Scientology is a destructive cult. A destructive cult has to do with a relationship between a leader figure and followers. You have to have a leader figure or figures, a leadership, and you have to have membership who believes in or follows that leader. And it doesn't even have to be religious in nature. A destructive cult can be a martial arts class, an acting class, a political group, as well as a religious group. We think about it in religious terms a lot, but if you got into some martial arts magazines, you'd be a little surprised, maybe, at how this is an acknowledged problem in the world of martial arts. So it isn't like, some strange dojo had a guy kind of go off the rails and start, dictating personal decisions for all of his students about how they should lead every aspect of their life. This happens a lot more frequently than people imagine. So I've come to describe this as an abusive relationship between a leadership and followers. And by abusive, I mean behavior that is cruel, inhumane, brutal, or even sadistic. A component of abuse is that it is unwanted or not agreed upon behavior, and that the treatment a person receives is harmful to them physically and or psychologically. We don't mean that it just makes a person feel uncomfortable or offended or argumentative. That's not abusive. Telling someone what you think about something is not abuse. That's just your First Amendment rights. Engaging in BDSM activity with another consenting adult is not an abusive relationship. You both are there on the same terms. You've agreed to what you're doing. On the other hand, engaging in a campaign of terror against a person by lying to their friends, family, and coworkers about them, now we're talking about abuse. Locking a person up in a closet or holding them against their will, that's abusive. And that's the kind of behavior that we're talking about when we talk about destructive cults. A destructive cult can exist between 2 people, or 2,000 people, or 2 million people. Size is not the determination. There are what we call narcissistic relationships, where a person has the unfortunate, finds themselves in a relationship with a malignant narcissist. And that person is abusing them verbally, maybe even physically. that is a destructive cult relationship, because that narcissist has power, undue influence, we call it, over their partner. It's the same dynamic on a bigger scale when you get into a group like Scientology. And the leadership, you know, the rules and regulations of Scientology were written by L. Ron Hubbard. He died in 1986. But then another guy took over. His name is David Miscavige. And he's kind of worse in some ways, right? And he just follows L. Ron Hubbard's playbook. So this can, you know, you can pass the torch in these cults. It's not just a one-generation thing. Although many, many, many of these groups do die off after their leadership does. So you know, there was a group, I think, called the Family or something. That guy died, and then it all just sort of disappeared. So cults spring up and die off, and sometimes they take hold because they have a compelling belief system. But it's not the beliefs that make it a cult. Here are a couple of characteristics of what I'm talking about. If you're going to evaluate a group as to whether it's a destructive cult or not, there's actually a checklist. Sociologists and psychologists have done a lot of work on this. Actually, ever since the 1960s, when a guy named Robert Lifton did a study of survivors from Chinese re-education camps, we'll call them. You know, when there was the communist uprisings in China, some Americans and French people and foreign people got caught up in that, and they got brainwashed, is what they were calling it back in the day. It's a very loose term that really doesn't mean a whole lot of anything, but they were trying to figure out what were these guys doing, because these people in China who got caught up in this got re-educated and then left China talking and praising China when they had been in this very abusive situation. So people were trying to figure out, why were these guys praising this horrible thing that they've been in? And studies started being done on this. And there's been a lot of psychological and sociological work done on it. A woman named Janja Lalich, who I've interviewed on my podcast, she's a really great woman, she put together a checklist, a sort of a cult 101 checklist. How do you know if a group is got characteristics of being maybe not so great? Here are a couple of the characteristics. The group displays excessively zealous and unquestioning commitment to its leader, and whether he's alive or dead, regards his belief system, ideology, and practices as capital the truth. It is that way or the highway, so to speak. There's not a lot of room for individual thought. Questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or even punished. The leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel. For example, members must get permission to date, change jobs, marry, etc. When I was in the Sea Org, I had to get okay from my commanding officer before I could get married, for example. Leaders prescribe what types of clothes to wear, where to live, whether or not to have children, how to discipline children, etc. Another example is the group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status for itself, its leaders, and members. For example, the leader is considered the Messiah, or a special being, or an avatar, or the group or the leaders are on a special mission to save humanity. And one other characteristic that's actually pretty important is the group has a polarized us versus them mentality, which may cause conflict with the wider society, right? There's nothing wrong with feeling like you're part of a special group, but when your group, whether it's the Boy Scouts or the Hare Krishnas or Scientologists, when your group are the only people who matter, and everyone else in the world are degraded, lesser people because they're not part of your group, you could see how there might be some problems created with that. So there are a couple different models. I'm going to just go through a couple other characteristics real fast, and then we'll get to the Q&A. Because I've been talking, and I want you guys to talk too. Janja Lalich again. There's different sociologists and psychologists put together different models to talk about how these groups behave. There's a guy named Steve Hassan who put together what's called the BITE model. And that is B-I-T-E, right? Behavior, information, thought, and emotion control. If a group engages in activity that could be considered B-I-T-E control, then you might have a destructive cult there. Every single group that gets analyzed on this has to be individually looked at. You can't just look at a group and go, oh, they have a strong belief system, they're a cult. It doesn't, it's a lot more nuanced than that. Janja Lalich put together what's called a bounded choice model. Your choices are bound or boxed in, okay? You have charismatic authority figure. You have a transcendent belief system. And an interesting example of this was Enron. You guys remember Enron, that business? They fit this model. And they were a company. Because inside Enron, a lot of people don't know this, but within Enron, they thought they had the business model to top every other business model ever. And if you didn't agree, you found yourself on the street pretty damn fast. It actually was a company as a destructive cult. And they believed their transcendent belief system was that they were going to bring their business model to every business in the world. You have a system of control or various systems of control in place, and you have various systems of influence in place. And the last thing I want to mention on that is that there is one way you can sort of think about this on a very personal level for yourself in terms of the groups you belong to or are part of, or when you look at other groups that other people you know are part of. Influence could be considered a spectrum, right? This chair has absolutely no influence over me whatsoever, right? I'm not bothered by this chair. It doesn't have any control or power over me. My mom? She's got a lot of influence over me, right? When my mom says to do stuff, yeah, okay, I'll do it. So it's a spectrum. You see what I'm talking about? And you could consider that there's a green and maybe a white and then a red zone of influence. And if somebody has so much influence over you that you don't feel that you have the ability to question or ask or say no or think differently than how that influence is being put over you, you might be a little too far down that spectrum of influence. So it's just a way of thinking about it. So some of these problems may have developed in groups you guys have been part of, and or will be in the future. So I wanted to just briefly say, kind of following along the lines of a seminar that was given yesterday. Actually, there was a whole leadership seminar given. It was really good. And if you join a group, any size, are there guidelines, are there rights, are there rules in place to protect you and protect the other people who are in the group and protect the leadership as well? If there aren't, if it's all just kind of loosey-goosey, well, that might be great when everything is running smooth and everything's fine and everybody's getting along. But the second there's a conflict or a problem or a disagreement of some kind, either whether it's with the leadership or between the members, are there structures in place to deal with that in a rational way? And does everybody understand what those guidelines and rules are? If not, you're asking for trouble. Trust me, I know. Yeah, basically a couple pieces of advice really that I have for you after telling you this whole story about this awful thing that I went through. Just don't become a member of a group assuming anything about how the group operates or what it will do in the face of adversity or conflict. And know what the requirements are, know what's expected of you beforehand, not when it's happening. Because in the heat of the moment, when the pressure's kind of there, either a social pressure or a leadership pressure, or even internal pressure from yourself. You know, oh, well, I really want this. You know, that's not the time to be questioning, should I, shouldn't I? You know, you kind of want to lay this stuff out beforehand. To the degree that a group is secretive, or it's not willing to tell its membership about itself or its practices, is the degree that there could be real trouble later on. Which is not to say that you have to be exposed to all the potential knowledge you would get in the group beforehand. I'm not saying that. There are levels to groups. There are layers to them. You're not going to get full disclosure about all the, whatever knowledge base might be there on day one. But you should get full disclosure on what your rights are as a group member and what's expected of you. There shouldn't be any gotchas on that. You don't want to find out 6 months in or a year in that you're supposed to have sex with the leader in order to get to the next level. I mean, you kind of want to know that before you commit to being involved in something for a year. Kind of what I'm talking about here, right? Just to give a real practical example.